Hello, I'm Des Dearlove. Welcome to the Thinkers50. My guest today is Cliff Bowman, Professor of Strategic Management at Cranfield School of Management and author of 8 books all about strategy. Cliff, welcome.
Thank you, Des. Nice to see you.
So, I mean, you've been researching this area for a very long time. You've been talking to companies, more importantly, for a very long time. All that stuff we did with strategy retreats and SWOT analysis and Porter's 5 forces and all that good stuff that we did in the 80s and the 90s, has that helped us?
To a certain extent, it is helpful because it gets a team of managers to focus on some questions that they don't ordinarily discuss. But our early experience of trying to run 3-day workshops, as we called them, was, had mixed outcomes. Sometimes it was very effective, but more often than not, it wasn't as effective as certainly the clients thought it was going to be. And one of the things that came out of that was that the tools and techniques that we had at the time didn't really work, not to our satisfaction. So people would do the technique, if you like, because we asked them to do it. But that very rarely fed into what ultimately they acted out subsequent to the workshop.
So in terms of strategy, I mean, one of the issues with strategy always, even if you go for the highfalutin kind of cerebral process, in the end, it's a political process, isn't it?
It's highly political because management power is at the heart of this. And one of the difficulties that we face is that there's often not enough knowledge at the center or the top of the organization to design the perfect strategy solution. And even if you could come up with that, then whatever actions that you take, you don't know what the consequences of those actions would be because we're dealing with a very complex system. I think it's healthier to think about strategy not as a document, but as an ongoing conversation around some key questions.
Okay, now you mentioned the questions there, and you have this model of 5 questions, but to some extent, what you're describing there is a process, is an attitude towards strategy that perhaps is, as you say, different to the way we thought about it before.
Well, I think that's probably the case. I think for a lot of people, they see strategy as the production of some document. We have a strategy, and they'll bring it out and they'll show it to you. But the reality is that those documents rarely get implemented. So they serve some purpose, an appearance of control, let's say, over the organisation. But reality overtakes them.
So let's take your 5 questions then. Let's talk about your approach to strategy.
Okay, now, and this is not an original list of questions, but we found that these questions help focus the discussion and the conversation in a helpful way. Where to compete? What markets should we be in? What segments of those markets should we be targeting? How to compete? How do we think we're going to gain and sustain competitive advantage? Following on from those 2 questions would be, well, what capabilities and assets do we need to do that? 4th question would then be, well, okay, compared to what we need, what have we got? What assets and capabilities do we have? And then the final, and perhaps the most critical one and the most difficult one, is how do we change? How do we change? How do we build the capabilities that are required to compete in these ways in these particular market choices that we've made?
Okay, so go back. Let's take the questions one at a time, if we may, and perhaps with an example. So the first question was all about how are we going to compete?
How do we compete? Okay. What we must have at the centre of that debate is a very clear and sophisticated, deep understanding of who are the customers, what they value, and what signifiers they use to make judgments about the things that they value. And what we've developed are some techniques that help people think that through. And a lot of people that I teach, a lot of executives that I teach, really struggle with that.
So give me an example. Give us a real company or sort of company.
Okay, well, I've got to be a bit careful here, Des. I'll give you an example from a pharmaceutical manufacturer.
Perfect.
I got them to focus on a choice of a particular product and a particular customer. The product they chose was an asthma inhaler. So when I went into their room, because they're all working in different rooms, I said, okay, so talk me through this. What's the product? They said, well, it's this. They showed me the thing. And I said, okay, who's the customer? And they went silent. And then somebody said, well, somebody with asthma. And I thought, well, okay, does that assume that everybody with asthma needs the same thing from this. So I then had to come up with different examples, you know, the little boy who's just been diagnosed as opposed to a sophisticated person over here that's had asthma all their lives, and do they want the same thing from the... And they really struggled. And then I said, okay, look, let's take this, the first case, the little boy who's just been diagnosed. He's in the doctor's surgery. There's him, there's his mother in tears, there's the doctor. I said, who's the customer? And of course, it isn't straightforward at all. So to get them to move from focusing on the product, which they thought was marvellous, to thinking about who are the customers and what they value, for them was really quite a challenge.
And how does that play then into the second question?
Well, the second question would be, if we're clear about how we're competing, then we would need to understand what capabilities and know-how we need to deliver the strategy, okay? Now, there's various ways you can compete. You can say, okay, what we'll do is we'll innovate. We'll come up with an even better asthma inhaler. Now, if that's your chosen way of competing, then you've got to think about how are we going to get innovation, more innovation out of the organisation that we've got. And a lot of organisations really struggle with that, because the tendency is, once they've got a product that sells, is everything orientates around that. And we take our eye off innovating. And so we kind of milk what we've got. And then when we realise, well, we actually need a new one, we just don't have those capabilities in the organisation.
So an alternative strategy at that point would be to compete on cost, presumably, as well. That would be another.
Yeah, I'd say compete on price, which implies that you have to be low cost. Yes, and then you've got different options there. You might say, well, okay, we stick with this particular asthma inhaler in this case, and we find the most efficient ways to produce it. We outsource parts of the assembly, let's say, and then the system is designed to produce this standard product at a very low price. If you chose to compete in a different way, of course, you'd end up with a completely different set of capabilities, like the innovation route. And these are choices that you have to make.
Which brings us to the third question.
Well, the third question is, what capabilities do we actually have? And one of the things that we've learned from the resource-based view of the firm, which I think you're probably familiar with, is that the real sources of advantage that firms have are really quite subtle. They're embedded capabilities that are in routines, that are not codified, they're not written down anywhere. This is the way these things have emerged and evolved over time. We've found when we've tried to audit the capabilities that are strategic and important for a particular firm, relationships that individuals have often come up as critical. Special know-how that a particular designer has, or a salesperson's empathy. And these are the resources which are critical, because most of the other resources that this firm has are exactly the same in another firm. So they cannot explain their superior performance. Once we can get people to focus on the strategic assets and capabilities, those that are valuable and rare, they've got a fighting chance of protecting them. If they don't really understand what those sources of advantage are, they can inadvertently destroy them really quite easily, because they don't really understand what they are.
So let's go back to our asthma inhaler. Let's say we've got a firm. We've agreed that at least one of the customers, the important customers, is the little boy himself.
Yes.
Who needs to be given a product in a way that perhaps brings some kind of degree of additional benefits to him.
Yeah.
Perhaps it can be in the colours of his favourite football team or something.
Yes.
So we've got him. We've then looked in terms of what we've got the capabilities to be innovative, to create products that would appeal to a young lad. What's the next? The next question presumably is what other capabilities we need.
Well, in that case, if we had the capabilities to produce this kind of standard version, we would need additional capabilities which would enable us to tailor it to a particular type of demand, like the little boy. Okay. Now, whether we have those in-house or not would be one of the challenges that we face.
And finally, presumably, if there's a gap between, so we've identified how we want to compete. We've identified how we're going to compete. We've then decided what capabilities we do and don't have.
Yes.
And the gap. Presumably that's the final part, as you said, the most difficult part in this jigsaw puzzle.
Well, the difficult thing is then how do we change? And unfortunately, what we know is that most firms delay change until there's a crisis. Change typically only occurs when there's a crisis or a change of leadership, and one often follows the other. Now, that is the biggest challenge that most firms face. Unfortunately, as I suggested, most firms settle on a solution, if you like, and then that builds in rigidity and inflexibility. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we face is that the way that we manage organisations encourages most employees to look upwards to please the boss rather than outwards to satisfy the customer. And in the absence of getting that feedback from customers, the organisation ossifies and then gradually drifts away from where the customers really need them to move. And that provokes the crisis, and then we get the change. So that's why I'm suggesting don't wait for the crisis. Keep these 5 questions at the front of mind. There's one we didn't talk about, which was where to compete, but never mind, okay? Keep these 5 questions to the front of mind as an ongoing conversation, right? Not some ossified plan that we stick in a document, but something that's a live part of the way that we interact as an organisation.
And there's 2 parts to that. One part is the having the active conversation, so that strategy is seen as a dynamic process.
Yeah.
But also there's this element that you referred to of remaining porous to the customer.
Yes.
So that the managers can still hear the customer's voice. How do you do that?
Well, that's very difficult because there's a lot of insulation. If you think of a large organisation of 5,000 people, there's loads of people that go in every day. They never interact with a customer. Now, they're reliant then on weak messages coming to them, ultimately feeding through from the people who do interact with the customers. I talk about a porous organisation, and it's trying to open that up and get the customer's voice in there so people can directly get feedback from customers and understand what it is that they value and what needs to change to improve our way of satisfying the customer.
Okay, so strategy, the way you're describing it, becomes as we said, a much more dynamic, living entity. Is that different from what Henry Mintzberg would talk about emergent strategy, or is it a similar kind of concept?
It is very similar. What Henry was contrasting was the kind of very top-down analytical design approach to strategy, which I don't agree, I agree with him, isn't workable. Because there just isn't the knowledge to design the right answers at the top of the organisation. They just don't know enough to do that. And because we're talking about an unknowable future, then it makes no sense to fix something now for 5 years. So yes, it's an emergent process, but it's not completely random. Okay, so if we're having conversations about these key questions, then that shapes what emerges. But because it's a live conversation, we don't fix on something that is unnecessarily constraining, and we're alert to unfolding events in the environment. That changes the conversation, changes our answers to those questions in the now.
The other thing that I'm hearing from you, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that if you're going to select a strategic direction, you're going to select a strategy according to where you think you want to play and who your customers are and things like that, then the management capabilities and competencies, how you manage effectively, will be also dictated to some extent by the strategy. There isn't a one-size-fits-all management practice.
Well, I'd certainly pick up on that. Yes, I'm very much of the view that we have to take a contingent approach. So one size does not fit all. I see these people write about certain prescriptions that you should be doing these things. We've all seen the books, Des. But that kind of assumes that these practices would work everywhere, that the more of them that you do, the better the organisation would be. And I completely disagree with that view.
So if a company is following, wants to be known as an innovator, that's how it's going to compete. That's part of the strategy. Go back to our pharmaceuticals company. And innovation is very important. How the sort of capabilities that you'd require to be in an innovative culture might be different to the sort of management capabilities and competencies that you want to be if you're going to compete purely on price.
I'd say they're absolutely distinct, and these are choices that you make. And of course, even if you chose to be an innovator, building those capabilities will take time. You can't just switch this thing on. There's what we call path dependence in this. So investments that you make today ultimately will feed through into the future in building those capabilities. If you take innovation, for example, you must loosen up the organisation. You must allow diversity. You must allow people to try things and fail. Now that's very different as a culture to one which is focused on standardized products producing to a cost in a very inflexible way.
And does that, presumably that starts back at corporate headquarters? I mean, that does that you know, back at the corporate centre, you have to send out the right messages to suit the strategy.
Well, if by corporate you're meaning multi-business unit organisations, then that's actually a different question to the 5 questions that we've gone through. I don't know if you want to talk about it, Des.
Yeah, no, let's have a 6th question.
All right. Well, this 6th question is really about why have you collected these different businesses together? And I talk about a value logic. There must be a rationale for grouping these firms together. Now, typically it's a synergy logic of some sort. But my argument is you cannot get a whole list of synergies from the same structure, systems and culture. So you have to make a choice about which of these sources of added value are we actually going to develop the corporation to achieve. And having made those choices, then you have to evolve the organisation towards the configuration, which is the term we use, that actually supports that value logic. And there's a number of value logics, okay? There's economies of scale, there's consolidating support functions, there's creativity, but each of them require a very different kind of organisation. Now, unfortunately, when I make this point to corporate executives, they say you're wrong. They say we're doing all of these synergies, and my response to that is, well, is it working? And of course, it isn't necessarily working as well as it might.
Okay, the other thing I wanted to talk to you about is Zoods. What's a Zood?
Well, this came out of the early work that we did in the strategy workshops that we mentioned at the beginning. We realised that we helped people come up with strategies, but there were these strategies never sustained. They never stuck to the strategies. And that's because there were key issues which never got discussed. And I came up with this term, zone of uncomfortable debate, because there were things that the elephant in the room, there were things that people all knew about, but they were never mentioned in these meetings because they were so difficult and so challenging. And what you end up then with was with a kind of phony consensus. So we're all agreeing on this strategy, knowing, of course, that these real critical issues were never debated. Now, the zone of uncomfortable debate, people shorten it to ZOOD. They talk about ZOOD issues, and that's quite nice. If you understand the argument about ZOOD, then you can use it as a language, and you can say, look, guys, we all know the ZOOD argument. There's a ZOOD issue here. Des, you know, we need to talk about it. And then once that's then allowed, if you like, in the meeting, that we can talk about this thing, you know, we can start to address some of these issues that if we keep ignoring them, then what we've got is something which is not agreement at all, because we never really discuss this thing, and we all know that it's critical.
So what are you working on at the moment?
Well, I'm working with a colleague, Andrei Pavlov, and one of the things we're trying to understand is the problems of management control, and how in organisations you get a lot of horizontal specialisation where people are just focused on a very narrow part of the overall task. But you also get this vertical specialisation. And what it seems to us is that ends up with people looking down at their very specialised activity and focusing their attention on that, looking up to try to please the boss. And as a consequence, the energy and the coordination of activity is directed in that vertical rather than outside to try to understand what's happening with clients, customers, how their needs are changing and so on. And this is actually pathologically disastrous, because then the organisation becomes so internally focused that it drifts away, as we've said, from the environment, and then precipitates the crisis.
So this is, in part, this is the antidote to. This is the way in which you can remain a bit more porous.
Well, that's one of the ways of getting that feedback in, because you'll only learn through feedback. Now, if the feedback's not coming in to the organisation where it needs to be in these different activities, then those activities will continue the way that they're continuing now. The routines will just be continually embedded, and there will be no adaptation.
So that's the ossifying effect.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, And it's a major issue. I mean, we talk about trying to make the organisation more porous. We haven't necessarily got all the answers to how you do that. But unless you start to understand that this feedback must get into the system, otherwise activities will just persist and routines will just persist.
Cliff Bowman, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Des.